the Institute for the Critical Study of Society at the Nebel Proctor Marxist Library. And we were formed about 15 or 20 years ago as the research and educational arm of the library to fulfill its mission of keeping the written heritage of Marx alive, and also to support people's struggles for peace, equality, anti-racism, and anti-imperialism. So that's who we are. We are a group of students, scholars, and activists who are involved in different aspects of the class struggles in the Bay Area and worldwide. Some of us are members of disciplined groups, some of us are members of undisciplined groups, and some of us are just independent people who are interested in Marxism. So the programs don't represent in any sense a group consensus on the issues that we're talking about, but we all share a common respect for the work of Karl Marx and a belief that his work will remain as important for the class struggles of the future as they have been for the class struggles of the past. So that's a little bit about who we are, and we're very fortunate today in having Steve Elner talk about what's the situation in Venezuela. And here to introduce Steve is Roger from the Task Force on the Americas, as well as the Institute.
Okay, so welcome to Sunday mornings at the Marxist Library. Thank you very much for coming. I want to briefly introduce the co-sponsor of this meeting here, which is the Task Force on the Americas, which is I'm on the board of that. Frame the Venezuela issue very, very briefly, introduce Steve, and then segue into Terry Madsen, who will also address us. So I'm with the Task Force on the Americas. This is our newsletter. We have copies of that out there. If you'd like to receive our newsletter, it's absolutely free, and it's a quarterly newsletter. And all you have to do is pick up a copy, and there's contact information, and you can get that. And we're always looking for more people to share our message, which is a message of humanitarianism. We were founded 23 years ago out of the sanctuary movement. That was when the dirty war in El Salvador was having political refugees up here, and they needed political sanctuary. We were founded around that, and I know some of you have been active since that time in those issues. So we were a humanitarian group. We learned very quickly, very, very quickly, that in order to be consistent humanitarians, we also had to be consistent anti-imperialists. When we listened to the social justice movements in Latin America, the message that we received was that the most important thing you could do to support us, to support humanitarianism, is to change your government. And that is why we are an anti-imperialist organization. Segueing into Venezuela, Venezuela has also been part of the effort to make the world a better place by ending the hegemony of imperialism. In 1998, Hugo Chavez was elected president of Venezuela, and that initiated the Bolivarian Revolution. And this was a true revolution, and like every true revolution, it both had indigenous aspects and international aspects. It had unique Venezuelan characteristics. One of them was the amalgamation of the Christian idea of a special option for the poor. And that was melded with the Marxist revolutionary idea of a government for and by the oppressed classes. It made very big successes. One of the most important things that it did was it made Venezuelan society much more inclusive. Inclusive particularly for poor people, for women, and people of color. At the same time, it engendered the eternal enmity of the oligarchy internally there and of the hegemon to the north, the United States. And in 2013, Hugo Chavez passed away. The Venezuelan people elected Nicolas Maduro, who inherited not only the revolutionary mantle, but all the problems that came with making a socialist revolution. Internal corruption, a oil-dependent economy, a dysfunctional economic system. And all these our speaker will be talking about. We are a solidarity group, and in the solidarity movement, there's been what I would call the kind of Goldilocks socialists. These are the socialists that say, we love socialism, but this socialism, that one's too hot, we can't touch it. And this socialism, that one's too cold. There's no socialism that they like. But we have to stand with the socialisms that we have. Steve Elner will be speaking about that. Steve is uniquely qualified, and I really mean uniquely qualified. Since he has a PhD in political science and economics, and that's his field. He is very widely published academically. He's written probably more books than I've read, though I've had the pleasure of reading some of his books. And he's also an activist, and in a moment I'm going to introduce Terry to tell us a little bit about Steve's activism. But the thing about Steve is that he's both academic and an activist, and a person with very deep understanding of what's happening in Venezuela based on his 40 years of living in and researching Venezuela. He, more than anybody else, knows the warts and problems of the Bolivarian Revolution as well as its good parts. But first, I would like to ask Terry Matson to speak very briefly, or as long as she wishes, on why we're doing this lecture, because it's not just an academic exercise, it is an exercise in solidarity. Thank you.
Thank you, Roger. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about the solidarity part of this morning. My name is Terry Matson. I am the program manager for a nonprofit project called the Intrepid News Fund, and we raise money to send journalists to Latin America and the Caribbean to cover underreported news that you do not see or hear in mainstream U.S. media. And so with that project, we put together a delegation in partnership with Venezuela Analysis, and went to Venezuela in May to observe the presidential elections, the re-election of Nicolas Maduro. And Roger joined us on that delegation. We were there for Election Day to do election observation, and then we stayed for a week. And we stayed for the week post-Election Day to cover news, to how the international world was responding to the re-election of Maduro and what was happening inside the country. We were able to have 14 different stories published that week while we were on the ground, and Roger was very helpful in making that happen as well. So while we were on this delegation, we were partnered with a number of other small independent delegations so as to create a large audience for more high-level meetings with government officials. And out of those meetings and out of partnering with some of the smaller groups from the US and Canada, we all came back in June and said, you know, the one thing that we can all do for Venezuela regarding solidarity work right now is to focus on the US and Canadian sanctions against Venezuela. These are unilateral sanctions. These are not sanctions that were taken to the member states of the UN or the OAS for a majority vote to impose. These were sanctions that have been unilaterally imposed by the United States. They affect Venezuela's ability to refinance foreign debt. They prohibit Venezuela from repatriating foreign earned profits, such as those profits earned by Citgo, the Citgo refineries here in the United States, that those proceeds cannot be sent back to Venezuela. It affects business contracts with foreign governments. The Brazilian government contracts with Venezuela for electricity in the northern states of Brazil. The Brazilians pay their fee every month. The banks do not distribute the funds back to Venezuela for fear of being fined by the United States banking system. They cannot buy food and medicine internationally. I'll give you an example with, and Steve, you can jump in here if there's more, if I'm off point. Regarding insulin, say, let's take that as an example. Venezuelans order insulin from a German pharmaceutical company. The insulin gets manufactured. The Venezuelans send the funds to Europe. The bank does not distribute the funds to the pharmaceutical company. The pharmaceutical company is not going to put the insulin on a ship and send it to Venezuela. So there's a lot of things that the government is attempting to do and is strangled by these sanctions. So in trying to solve these international macroeconomic problems that will eventually allow them to solve the small, the more individual problems on the ground at home, it's impossible. And almost anything new that the Venezuelan government tries to initiate, there's some sort of sanction or stranglehold placed on them to prevent it. So for those of us, when we came back, we thought this is the type of thing we need to do, is come home and talk to all of you about what those sanctions are and what they're really doing. We created the campaign to end U.S. and Canada sanctions against Venezuela to do projects like we're doing this morning. Steve was very gracious in doing a webinar for us in August, and we all thought he was right on point, right politics, right message, right experience, that we asked him if he'd be interested in doing a North America tour to bring his knowledge out to all of you. He started in Boston, I think, 4 weeks ago. We've had him up in Eastern Canada. He worked his way west across Canada, flew to Sacramento from Vancouver on Wednesday, and he's been talking ever since. So that's why he's here. That's how this tour all came about, and the whole point is to get all of this information out to you and to hopefully have you join our campaign and help us educate as many people as possible as to what is happening in Venezuela. So with that, I'll introduce Steve Elner.
I think that in order to understand what's happening in Venezuela, it's important to address the positive aspects and also the downsides. And in doing so, it's important to discuss the position of those who just see the downside. And I'm not referring just to people on the right of the political spectrum or the center of the political spectrum. I'm referring to people who call themselves Chavistas. They support, or they state that they support and supported Chavez when he was elected president in 1998 up until his death in 2013. So they say they're Chavistas, but they are anti-Maduristas. They don't support the current government of Nicolas Maduro. Maduro was selected by Chavez when he was went off to Cuba in late 2012, and it seemed pretty certain that he wasn't going to make it. So that, and Maduro was kind of like his right-hand man. He was the foreign minister up until then. So there are some people who see the negative and don't see the positive. And I think that it's important to address that issue in order to avoid two extremes. One extreme is people who just see the bright side of the Chavista governments and kind of gloss over the very difficult situation that Venezuelans are facing, and perhaps some of the errors that have been committed that explain those errors, and those on the left who just hop on the errors without seeing the context, without seeing what really was going on the ground, that explains the government's, perhaps in some cases, overreaction to that situation, and policies that have fed into the problems, that are also related to what Terry just discussed with regard to the sanctions, and not just the sanctions. The sanctions begin with Trump, but the aggressiveness.
Obama.
I'm sorry, Obama. I've done this before. Yeah, okay. We have to go back to Obama and to Bush, because this war that has been going on. Maduro refers to the economic war, but I call it war because it takes in much more than economics. They go back to President Bush and to President Obama. There are four areas that I'd like to discuss with regard to these downsides, but also positive aspects of the government's policies. One is the social programs. The social programs involve popular participation, especially at the community level, in terms of decision making. The community councils, or the communal councils, were created in 2006. And they were created as a result of a law that was passed called the Law of Communal Councils, in which the government allotted money to the communities, but that money went through the communal council, so that communities throughout Venezuela were told by government officials that went into the communities that they would be eligible for the allotments, the allocations, but only if they had established communal councils. And as a result, 20,000 communal councils, currently the official statistic is over 40,000 communal councils, were created in communities between 200 and 400 families. And so this was an example of what you could call a top-down process in which the government, more or less decreed the creation of these communal councils. I mean, they decreed them in the sense that the communities realized if they didn't set up communal councils, then they wouldn't be eligible for this funding. So the government, in a sense, activated a process, and a process not only in the popular sectors of the population, but particularly in the marginalized sectors. And it's important to make a distinction. And from a Marxist viewpoint, we make a distinction between the working class and the marginalized sectors that aren't in the formal economy. They're workers, but they're not members of the proletariat. And more or less 50% of the population throughout Latin America belong to this informal economy. They're the street peddlers. They're the people who work for companies that aren't legally recognized, or others that are legally recognized but are so small that you don't have unions. So I make reference to the marginalized sectors, that is the informal economy, the people who don't have any kind of job security because they don't work for companies, they basically work for themselves. And the semi-marginalized, these are the workers who work for very, very small companies. They don't have unions, and they have very little job security. So these people don't have experience with organizations. And so for the first time in their lives, they belong to these communal councils, which meet in these meetings called Asambleas de Ciudadanos y Ciudadanas, citizen assemblies. And in those citizen assemblies, the assembly decides what the public works project is most important for them. and they apply for funding. Once they get funding from the city government, from the state government, or from the Ministry of Popular Participation, now known as the Ministry of the Communes, then they oversee the carrying out of these public works projects. And in some cases, the government has actually encouraged them not to apply for funding that is funneled through a construction company, but that the communal councils receive the funding directly and carry out the public works projects, hiring people from the community. And that's another aspect of the communal councils, is that the workers on the public works projects, be it roads, be it electricity, water projects, etc., that the workers come from the same community. Housing as well. This is a big thing. Under Chavez, in the latter years of the Chavez government, and now under Maduro, the housing mission, which has built over 1 million houses, so that the workers on these projects are workers who live in the community. And you might say, in these marginalized community, what about plumbers, electricians? That has to come from elsewhere. Well, that's not the case. All these very, very poor communities have construction work, the people who have experience doing construction work as bricklayers or electricians or plumbers, etc. So I go into a certain amount of detail about this because those people who are on the left, who are opposed to sanctions, who are opposed certainly to any kind of military intervention, but who say, I'm a Chavista, but I'm not a Madurista. And Maduro is basically, they may not say it, but they certainly imply it and they certainly believe it, that Maduro is bad as the opposition, the right-wing opposition. Because in Venezuela, you don't have any progressive opposition for the most part. Very, very, very little. I mean, the opposition is, for the most part, the radical opposition that doesn't even want to reach power by electoral means. They want to reach power through force. And I can get into that a little bit later. But so this position of a plague on both your houses, Maduro and the opposition, what they say with regard to these social programs is, yeah, the social programs are good. They're building housing for the poor, and they leave it at that. They don't talk about the incorporation of the people in these communities in the decision-making process. They don't talk about the fact that for the first time, many, many people who previously didn't have any kind of experience in decision-making, now they're involved in all the aspects of the applying for funding, choosing the project that is for them the most important, overlooking the carrying out of the project, insisting that the workers be workers that live in the community, not outsiders, and overseeing the carrying out of the project. This is a novel experience for these people, and involves participation, it involves incorporation, and it involves another word that Chavez used to use, even though it's not in the dictionary. If you have a Spanish dictionary, you won't find it, but it's an English word, empowerment. So Chavez began using the word empoderamiento. That is something that this plague on both your houses position doesn't talk about. I've done a lot of reading on that, and this from my own research. Both, activists or analysts, as well as academics, who are also analysts, but publish in academic journals and publish books. These people who would consider themselves on the left, but they do not recognize the positive aspect, other than saying, well, money for the poor, that's good. But they don't talk about empowerment. They don't talk about incorporation. They don't talk about participatory democracy, which incidentally is another topic, a second topic, democracy. You can talk about the downside. There are things that the government does which you can criticize from a democratic viewpoint. Just to give you one example, the opposition candidates for president, or at least one of them, criticized the government because the Electoral Council stipulated that the opposition candidates had so many minutes to broadcast the opposition propaganda on the government TV channel. And apparently, I don't know whether this is the case or this is what, at least this is what the opposition says, they didn't get the time that was officially allotted to them to broadcast the message on the government channel. Of course, you have a majority of channels that people listen to are private channels. And that was a different story on the private channels. But these are criticisms you can make. But then the positive side is the participatory democracy. It's a new concept. It's a concept, it's not a new concept. I was in SDS in the 60s, and that was a term that the SDS people used a lot, participatory democracy. That was a slogan. So it's not a new concept, but at least for Venezuela it is. And for other countries in Latin America, Bolivia and Ecuador, in all three cases, Bolivia, Ecuador, and Venezuela, in all three cases, they drafted new constitutions. In the case of Venezuela, it was drafted and ratified in a referendum in December of 1999. This is the Chavista Constitution, and it is based on participatory democracy. The concept is incorporated into the Constitution, as it was in Bolivia and Ecuador. So, what does participatory democracy mean? Firstly, these communal councils are an example of that. And the Chavistas believe that these communal councils and the communes that are grouping the communal councils, that this represents a new type of democracy, that eventually this will replace the municipal councils that are based on representative democracy. I'm going to use this water here. There's a lot of talk about a new model, a new democratic model. That the old model was based on electoral, or what in Venezuela is referred to as representative democracy. What we would call in the United States liberal democracy. And liberal democracy is also a model that goes back to the 18th century. John Locke, Madison, James Madison here in the United States, and other Enlightenment people in Europe in the 18th century, Montesquieu, based on checks and balances. So there's another model of democracy which really dates back to people who are writing in the 18th century, and that is sometimes referred to today as radical democracy or participatory democracy. It's based on the idea that the people decide themselves directly. So it's direct democracy. And the Chavistas would say that that is the guiding light for them. They want to replace representative democracy with direct democracy. but there are also people in the Chavista movement who would say that what they support is a combination of both. You'll continue to have elections, but you'll also have direct democracy, of direct participation in the decision-making process. And I think that's really where it's at today. And that's where it's going to be at for some time into the future. Just to give you an example of this direct democracy, the Constitution of 1999 allows for referendum and also recall elections. That has been put to practice on a number of occasions in Venezuela. Chavez himself was up for recall in August of 2004. The opposition got enough signatures on petitions. At first the Chavistas were saying that they didn't, and there was this big debate because they said that some of these signatures were not valid. And Chavez really surprised everybody when he said, the opposition is right. They got enough signatures, and we're going to go to a recall. Some of the Chavista people thought that that was a mistake, that the opposition didn't get enough signatures, and that Chavez should have taken a more hardline approach. But no, Chavez said no. Now we're going to, going to face the opposition, and he won the recall election with 58% of the vote. The opposition didn't recognize those results because the opposition in Venezuela is what political scientists call, this term, a disloyal opposition. Disloyal means an opposition that doesn't recognize the legitimacy of the government. And the opposition has been that way pretty much ever since 2001, at least. 2001 up until the present. The Chavez and now Maduro are illegitimate. They claim that the electoral process is flawed. And they usually don't recognize the results except when they win. And they've won twice. And one time in a referendum and another time in the elections for Congress, the National Assembly. So in 2004, they didn't recognize the results, but Carter and the Carter Center were in Venezuela. Carter said in Venezuela, these elections are valid. Jennifer McCoy, who I know quite well, who headed the Latin American section of the Carter Center, who is anything that you like other than a Chavista. She's anti-Chavez. She's anti-Chavez in the sense that she, as an academic, believes that Chavez, was not a good guy. She wrote a book, or co-edited a book about that I reviewed, and that's her position academically. But she was there, and she said the same thing. She said those elections, from a legalistic viewpoint, were completely valid, and she was declared practically persona non grata by the opposition. Had the opposition in power, she would have been declared persona non grata. And she was attacked. She was viciously criticized by the opposition all over the place, even here in the United States. So in any case, that system of referendum and recall is part of this new concept of direct participation in decision making. Because electoral democracy, you vote for the president, you vote for the Congress people, you vote for the mayors, governors, etc. But the concept of a referendum, you're deciding on policy. If you get enough signatures, you can get a national vote on whether such and such a policy will be implemented. Or you can decide whether somebody who's in office will stay in office. Well, here in California, you know all about that. In fact, Schwarzenegger was elected governor that way, through a recall election. But that's not the case with, on a national level. We can't vote Trump out of office. I mean, if we had that here in the States, we would do that. Or we could end the war, in Afghanistan, or so many other things. The $15, minimum wage. or some of the things that Bernie Sanders proposes, which the politicians are not getting. Bernie Sanders wasn't elected president, but the things that he proposes has a majority support. The polls indicate that. If we had the referendum at the national level, maybe Bernie Sanders wouldn't be elected president, but the things that he proposes would be ratified by the